So plastic, it is the linchpin of our modern society. We use millions of tons of it. I think it's this year we're going to produce more plastic by weight than there are people by weight. There's tons and tons of this stuff, and not all of it can be recycled. And the stuff that you recycle to reuse, well, it degrades every time you use it. So we are creating mountains of plastic waste that we're worse than useless at managing. Now, everybody knows you get some oil, that's where you get plastics. So we can go from oil to plastic. But how about going from plastic to oil? Can we do that? Well, the answer is yes, of course we can. But to look at the reasons we don't do it and what the challenges are, perhaps we first ought to get an idea of how we get from oil to plastic. Crude oil is formed from the remains of microscopic plants and animals that once lived in the sea. When these organisms die, they sink to the sea bed. Over time, the dead plants and animals get buried under layers of sediment. The sediments keep oxygen away and stop the remains decaying. As more sediments are deposited, the pressure and the temperature increases. Chemical reactions gradually turn the remains into oil. The oil gets trapped because it rises up through permeable rocks until it reaches an impermeable layer, and that forms an oil reservoir. Now, when oil first comes out of the ground, it's thick and black and tarry and next to useless. It needs further processing, and processing in terms of crude oil uses something called fractional distillation. In an oil refinery, there is a large column called the fractional distillation column. The crude oil is heated up in a furnace and then pumped into that large column. And it relies on the fact that liquids boil at specific and very different temperatures. And of course, as they boil, they form a gas. The gases rise up through the column, cool at specific temperatures, and we get different layers in there, or different fractions in there, of the liquids that we're interested in, where height is directly related to the weight of the liquid, because the less heavy it is, the easier it is to boil off, the further up the column it will go because it's lighter, and then it condenses into the liquid, and that's how we separate out the different components of the crude oil. Now, that's just the basic processing. The heavy oil can be further processed in a process called cracking, because oil is just chains of carbon and hydrogen, and using heat and catalysts we can break those down further into more useful products. The fractions we're most interested in are LPG and naphtha, as they're the basis of the plastics industry. They need to undergo further cracking to release a whole lot of other useful materials, as well as quite a lot of hydrogen. Benzene is used mostly as a glue in pharmaceuticals and things like insulation. Butadiene is used as a synthetic rubber, and you'll find it in tyres and clothing. Ethylene and propylene are the plastics we know. They need further polymerization, that is more reaction with the catalyst, to form things like polyethylene, which you find just absolutely everywhere, and equally to form things like polypropylene, which is much harder and heat resistant, so you find it in harder plastics. Now, one thing you might have noticed on that journey from tiny dead animal to plastic product is how much energy had to be put in there. We had to put in energy to form the crude oil, then we had to drill it, transport it, refine it, and polymerize it into plastics. By far the biggest input of energy was done for us by Mother Nature. That process of turning the tiny dead animal or plant into crude oil requires high temperature, high pressure, and millions of years. It's a lot of energy that's gone into that base material. To take that base material and then turn it into a plastic product, of course we need to input more energy, but inputting more energy than we get back out of it is somewhat pointless. And of course Mother Nature has done that big job for us. So if we want to reverse this process of taking that plastic and turning it back into an oil, we're going to have to input energy. And of course we need to input less energy than we're going to get back out of it, and that, surprisingly enough, is the big challenge. It's how to get back to oil without inputting too much energy. Because it's actually really easy to do if you're happy to input too much energy. It's just called pyrolysis, and there's a ton of YouTube videos on how to do that, including videos of my own on the channel showing you how to do that process. Of course, what we really need to do is exactly that process, but be able to reduce the amount of energy that we put in there. And of course, what comes in there is a catalyst. Molecules are held together by just a few bonds, and a chemical reaction is about breaking a few bonds and then making new bonds with new atoms to make new molecules. Now, broadly, breaking bonds takes energy, whereas making bonds gives out energy. Some bonds are stronger than others, so they take more energy to break, but they give off as much energy as they take when they make the new bond. For example, a hydrogen molecule has two hydrogen atoms. It takes a small amount of energy to break the bond between them, actually 1.73 times 10 to the 22 calories. If we let those atoms rebond, then exactly the same amount of energy will be released. The reaction of hydrogen plus oxygen to form water takes two hydrogen molecules and one oxygen molecule. To start the reaction, the bonds between the hydrogen and the oxygen need to be broken, and that takes a lot of energy. But using a catalyst will reduce the amount of energy that it takes. And that's because catalysts have a high affinity for some reactants. A catalyst like platinum, for example, has a high affinity for hydrogen, so it breaks the bond spontaneously, and hydrogen basically just sticks to the platinum. That means you don't have to supply the amount of energy needed to break the hydrogen bond, because it's already broken, and that decreases the total amount of energy you need to start the reaction. That's the activation energy, the energy needed to break those bonds in the first place. Hydrogens attached to carbons in compounds like diesel fuel maintain their affinity for platinum and make partial bonds to it. This decreases the energy that it would take to break all the carbon to hydrogen bonds, and that lowers the activation energy. That is the role of catalysts. So turning plastics into oil, well, everybody knows how to do it. In those kind of terms, it's pretty trivial. It's just the reverse of what you did in the first place. You take your feedstock, give it a bit of pressure and a bit of heat, and hey presto, it'll all break off and bubble off into oils and fuels. But that's not where the issue is, remember. The issue is reducing that energy input. And so that's why companies like Aduro, a Canadian startup company, come in. They found a catalyst that will do a very good job at that. And of course, they're quite happy to give factory tours. Why not? The process is something that everybody knows and there's nothing new in it. But there's not a chance that they're going to tell you what their secret sauce is, what their catalyst mix is, because that is where the true secret of all of this lies, and worth a lot of money, so of course I'm not going to tell you, and who would blame them? Anyway, I thought I would explain the process, where it comes from, what the issues are around it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching. Oh, and please don't forget to like and subscribe.